All right, well, let's get started today with what I consider the first exciting thing about controlling what you're doing with programming. So today we're going to talk about control flow. So let's go over our agenda. We're going to talk about what control flow is. We'll talk about if, else, and else if, which are the kind of main tools that we'll use to control the flow of our program. And then we'll talk about logical operators inside our code. So what is control flow? Well, generally, when we write our code, we want it to run from top to bottom, right? The same way we read a book, we want the computer to read and execute our code. So, for example, if I do console log first, console log second, what I would expect is that we come out first and second, right? If it was, console log second and first, or if it was non-deterministic, where the computer just did whatever we want, it'd be very hard for us to reason about what our code was doing, right? So we want to do it in the order that we run it. Now, what happens is that oftentimes we want our program to do different things depending on the current state of the situation, right? So we don't want to run every line of our code. We want to do this if something is happening, else do that if other conditions are met, right? So, in some cases we don't want any lines of code to run at all. So what control flow does is enable us to decide which lines of code are run based off certain conditions in our code base, right? So the if statement is an example of a JS feature that allows us to affect control flow. There's a few other ones, while, for, but if is the most common one, and the one we'll look at today. So if is pretty simple. It starts with the if keyword, then two parens around an expression. Then there's curly brackets surrounding the lines of code to run if the expression inside the if evaluates to true. So here, if true, console log, I'm in the if, and then close bracket. So if what's in those two parens is true, then we'll do the console log. So here, we should expect to get in the if. Here we go. If we have an if statement, or if we have a console log, can I see you? Now if we say if false, console log, sorry, no. Then if true, console log, I'll be there. What will we expect here? So the first line is unadorned by any kind of additional control flow, right? So it's just a line by itself, so we expect it to run. And the second one, on line 3, what happens is if false. So inside the expression, inside the curly brackets, the expression false is a false statement, so it won't run what's inside the curly brackets on line 3 and 5. So we should not expect to see the console log, sorry, no. Now on line 7, if true, that true, of course, evaluates to true, and so we should expect to see what's on line 8, that I'll be there. So that's what we get. Can I see you? I'll be there. Now let's do another more complicated example. Let's say we have neatnum equals to 7. Now if we do if neatnum equals to 7, console log, well, that's 7. Now if neatnum equals 8, console log, well, that's an 8. Well, here what we should expect is that on line 1, we assign the value 7 to neatnum, right? And then so on line 3, what the if statement is going to do is say, hey, look, let me look at this expression. Does neatnum equal to 7, right? And here, this expression should evaluate to the value of true, right? The Boolean value of true. And so we should see the console log on line 4. Now, then it will console log that on line 4, and then it will keep going down, and it'll say, well, does neatnum equal to 8? There, it will get the answer no, right? It will get false. And then that false tells the if statement on line 7 to not run what's on line 8. Now, what's interesting here is that, unless something happens to neatnum, because we can read this pretty clearly that says nothing happened to neatnum between line 5 and line 7, so guarantee that neatnum will not be affected. Guarantee that the expression on line 7 will return false. All right, so we should say, wow, that we only get, wow, that's a 7. Okay, now let's talk about the else clause. So we have the if statement. The if statement says, if this expression is true, do it. Now the code in the else block will run only if the expression in the if evaluates to false, right? So what this gives us an ability to do is that if the if statement comes back and says, I'm not going to run what's in my curly brackets, the else lets the programmer say, okay, if you got a false, at least run this, right? So here, example, do if false, console log in the if, else, console log in the else. Right? So the false on line 4, of course, evaluates to false. And so the if statement says, you know what? I got a false in my expression, in my conditional expression, so I'm not going to do what's on line 5. I'm not going to run the console log. So the programmer did specify an else clause, in which case that will actually run, since line 4 came out false. So on line 7, the else would say, you know what, I'm going to run no matter what, and I'll do console log in the else. So let me change that. It's not going to run no matter what. It's going to run if the if statement it's attached to did not run. So here we should only get in the else. Now, third, in this kind of triumvirate, we have something called the else if clause. So the code in the else if clause has its own condition and only runs if that condition also evaluates to true. So what that means is that if we have an if false, console log in the if, and we do an else if true, console log in the else if, what happens here is that the one on line 4 evaluates to false, right? So we shouldn't expect to see line 5 run because that expression is false, and so the body of the if statement does not run. Now on line 7 we have else if true. Now the way we read this is that unlike else, which would run if the if is false, this else only runs if the statement attached to it is, if the expression attached to it is also true, right? So this one, true is true, and so we should expect line 8 to run. And here we see in the else if. So here we can see another example with the else if clause. So let's say we'll assign Ada to name. Now if name equals Ada, console log hi Countess Lovelace. Else if name equals Grace, we'll say hi Rear Admiral Hopper for Grace Hopper. Else console log hi friend. So we see these three used together pretty commonly, where we have an if statement to describe what's our first case that we want to take care of. And if that doesn't pass, we'll go through all the else ifs in order, right? So if the first if does not pass, we'll say, well, else, if this thing is also true, do what's in line 6. And then if none of those pass, it will run line 8, the else on line 8, and say hello friend, right? The general case. So you kind of think of this as a set of fall throughs, right? If this first thing is true, do it. If that's not true, check all the other else ifs in the order. And if none of those are true, go to the else. And the one thing to be careful about is that even if the else if is true, it doesn't also run the else. So in this structure, it will only ever run one of these three, right? You can't run, let's say, if name equals Ada is false, name equals Grace is true, and then you have a third one, else if true, that won't run. Only one of the else ifs will run, even if multiple ones are true. So that's something to be careful of. So here we should expect with name equals Ada, we'll run the one on line 3. Then if we change name equal to Grace, we should see the one on line 6, hi Rear Admiral Hopper. And then if we set name to Ashi, we should say hi friend, right? Because the if failed, the else if also failed, and so the default case of the else ran, and we say hi friend. Right, the next thing we want to talk about is logical operators. So it sounds a little bit heavy topic, but logical operator just is different ways we can combine this logic of true-false logic, right? So we call this kind of logic the Boolean algebra, and it's really just the idea is that we only have true or false, and not like kind of a continuous spectrum of what can be true. So in JavaScript, we have double ampersand as a logical AND operator, and this returns true if both values on if it's placed between two values that are both true. So if it's true on the left and true on the right, then that ampersand will return true. So in this example, if true and true, this is say if true and if this left is true and the right is true, then this whole expression will return true. So we'll say in the first if true and false, now the false of course evaluates to false, and so this whole and expression also evaluates to false. So here we should only expect to see in the first if, right? So this and is very picky. With double ampersand, you say it needs both things to be true, and any of the other three configurations will evolve to false, right? So if they're both false, that's false. If the left one is false and the right one is true, it's false. If the left one is true and the right one is false, it's false. And then only if they're both true, it evaluates to true. Now, double pipe sign are two straight lines. That's the key above the enter key on most Macs, just in case you're not familiar with that symbol. Two of those is the logical OR operator, right? And so this returns true if either one of the values on either side of it are true, right? So if false or true, console log in the first if. If false or false, console log in the second if. And again, with this example, we should expect to only get in the first if, right? Because that the false are true, one of those was true, and that was enough for the OR operator. But of course, if both are false, then the OR operator also evaluates to false. So this one is is much more loose with things than the and sign, right? The double ampersands only has one case that's true. This one has 3 cases out of 4 that are true, right? If either are true or both are true. And so this, I think, if and the logical operators is pretty readable for us, even just coming from the logic that we use in our daily lives, right? So we say like, if that thing is true and this other thing is true, then do this. That's us using the ampersand. If it's raining and we're going out today, then carry an umbrella, right? If one of those is false, then we wouldn't need to carry the umbrella. So this should over time match pretty well with our intuitive ideas around and or logic. So as you're reading this, try to keep, if you can't really express what you're trying to say in code, try to see if you can figure out, step back and say, how do I express this just in normal English? And then kind of translate that into something that I can put into my if statements. All right, so a quick recap. In this lecture, we talked about what control flow is, right? Which is really at a high level is the parts of the program that we want to run are not run based on the state of the program at that point, right? And so control flow is the first tool we have as programmers to really have programs do various things under different conditions. In this one, we studied 3 operators: else, or if, else, and if else. And those are ways to do. If is just saying that if this is true, do this. Else is saying if is not true, do something else. And then if else is saying, well, let me go through a series of true tests, and if any of those pass, run the first one. In this one, we also talked about 2 logical operators: double ampersand, which is the and operator, and that checks if both things on its left and right are true. And then double pipe, which is the or operator, which checks if either one or both are true, and then that will evaluate to true. All right, see you in the next lecture.